Hi, my Fruit Loops. What's going on? What is up, my dudes? It is Sunday. It's not Wednesday. Anyway, what did I want to talk about today? I guess I just wanted to talk about the concepts of innocence and despair and nostalgia and many other things if I decide to talk about those things. I don't know if they'll come up or if they won't. Who knows? But yeah, I don't know. I guess it's been something that's been on my mind from time to time that I've thought about, that I've read things about. And I don't know, maybe this will clear things up a little bit, um, lead to some sort of revelation or something. If not, I guess they'll be fun to explore. It's the friends. Maybe it's what's the saying? Um, maybe the innocence is the friends we made along the way, right? Yeah, I think that's right. So, innocence. And I'm not talking about legal innocence or anything like that. I am just talking about kind of the innocence of that which one might imagine is common to children, to young children, to the earliest parts of our lives. If you were lucky, you had good parents and a stable living situation and went to a good school and didn't get bullied or all of that sort of stuff. But maybe like in a deeper sense, even than that. I mean, obviously, those things lead to that sort of environment or that sort of inner world, you could say. But there's a sort of very deep component of this, I think, and very existential. And maybe that's where I'm kind of going with it. I guess just going back through life, my early childhood, all the way through elementary school, I would say it was very happy overall. And maybe is like for me the pinnacle of innocence. And I know that there's some of that that's kind of the golden halo of childhood. There's some of that I wasn't happy or I was anxious or whatever, had my struggles when I think about it during those times. But just like overall, especially looking back, just felt like such a different time and a different life, different person. They always say, I don't know if they always say, but they say, the scientists, that every 7 or so years or whatever, like all of the cells in your body kind of go through like basically because your cells are always, um, multiplying, dividing, and dying eventually. So like all of the cells that were there have died. And so, and I guess been replaced by, let's say, their descendants, their younger successors. So like you're literally not the same person, I guess, on a cellular level. Um, anyway, though, I guess the point being, yeah, like it feels like I'm a different person from that. Like it's almost like I woke up one day with those memories like transplanted. It's hard to say exactly where the transplantation ends and I begin. If that makes sense. Like what do I really identify with and what just feels like, oh my God, that was me, I guess, but it just doesn't really quite feel like it's exactly me sometimes when I think about it. I guess going back to innocence, yeah, there are just so many things that I didn't know about, you know, so many things on like a sort of deep spiritual level. And I guess like the thing is like I knew like I want like my parents, my dad specifically had us watch like The Matrix like when we were very young. And so for example, or like I figured out that we were all going to die when I was pretty young. The two might have been related, but I can't remember. But in any case, like, so I had some of these existential sort of things that like kind of showed up almost like, Rumpelstiltskin or something like that. Just like showed up and we're kind of like, we're gonna come back. You made your own little deal with us to get us to go away for now, but we're gonna come back eventually. This is not the last that you will see of us. There were sort of like temporary bouts that I could kind of get away from and get back to a sort of Edenic existence. Yeah, the concept of the Garden of Eden is just very interesting, just like such a foundational myth. I assume that it like comes from like older sorts of traditions and such, and so I would say this sort of idea is probably very fundamental to a lot of cultures, a lot of human culture. Um, and then, yeah, even the idea of the Garden of Eden as it stands today is foundational in a lot of cultures. And that sense of like innocence. And I guess that's what's interesting, isn't it? Because innocence is really tied up with not knowing. Like in the Bible, I believe, it really is like eating from the tree of knowledge, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, specifically, is what destroys the innocence of Eden, of being able to stay in Eden. It is before that point, for example, that like Adam and Eve didn't need clothes to cover their modesty, you could say, because they weren't even like really aware of that concept, I guess. And so it's like weird maybe that like these things sort of existed, we just didn't know about them. And I guess that's the whole point. Yeah, I always thought it was a bit of a stupid story, like in terms of like as like a sort of normative like prescription of like, oh, well, you should do like what God tells you to and not listen to the serpent. It's like, well, obviously, like if God was perfect, if the humans were perfect, like why wouldn't they have ever listened to the serpent? Like whatever. There's some deep problems there with this idea of like perfection and whatever. And I know like, Christians always like to go back to the idea of like, oh, well, what about their free will? And it's like, okay, well, whatever. Anyway, though, we're gonna just shove that aside because that's stupid. And it's fun to think of it for me from like kind of a more descriptive, like sort of perspective, where it's like it's kind of describing in a sense what it feels like, what it is like to lose your innocence. That is to seek knowledge or to be burdened with knowledge, I guess, and like a deep sort of knowledge, or maybe one should even say of understanding the sorts of things that are out there in the world, whether it be one's loss of modesty or whether it be just the sort of pains and horrors, uncertainties, and all of that are just very intrinsic to the world we live in. And I guess that's what is understood once Adam and Eve eat the forbidden fruit, or that's my interpretation of it anyway. Yeah, so that's one of my thoughts, I guess, about innocence and the loss of innocence. Yeah, I don't know, because like after that, once you're out of the garden, I guess, or when you see deeply into the nature of the world in that way, where at some level you understand that nothing can be taken for granted, that there's no guarantee. Even in something like Christianity, there's no guarantee. And well, I mean, it depends maybe on what sect you like kind of follow. But there are plenty of sects in Christianity where like you're not guaranteed even whether you're going to heaven or hell, or you're not guaranteed of the knowledge of that. So like for example, in like Calvinism, my understanding of that is that you are predestined. So there's like an elect of people who are predestined to heaven, and so you can't actually change that. God kind of predestined that at the beginning of time or whatever. But nobody knows who the elect really are. So this is like kind of the fucked up part of that. But it kind of just goes to show that like yeah, there's no matter what you kind of like believe, like there's no guarantee at a very deep level. It's always like no matter how certain you are of something, the uncertainty runs one level deeper. It's always like a sort of mirage. And that's kind of like very frightening to have to like face up to. And we kind of grow up in environments where I mean, well, I should preface that again with like, if we're lucky, we grow up in environments where you are really just surrounded by that bubble of like safety, of certainty, of things kind of just making sense for you. Of yes, maybe even things can kind of hurt you, but there's always just like some way in which it's like okay. There's always mom, or whatever, the the archetype of mom to kind of go back to your safe space, from which you can kind of explore the world. And I guess like in us mammals, at the very least, that is just something that is really, really, really deeply ingrained. And yeah, there are some kind of horrifying experiments on animals, and that's like another topic that show the power that that sort of has over us. So it's very deep, that sense. And like I think that it really does influence how we like kind of see the world, how we how we feel about the world, that we're just very biased, you could say, towards having that conviction that there is something, there's some sense of like I don't know, not even just cosmic justice, but cosmic sense, that things just should make sense. And that if they temporarily don't, that they will right themselves into making sense. And the perverse part of that is that the universe is very not that in in the deepest sense, I guess. Like you could say like maybe locally there is like some sense and some order. We have like the laws of physics and stuff like that, but globally at the deepest level, there's just no guarantee. There's there's no like preordained point. There is nothing like that. And that is really terrifying for us, at least us mammals. Maybe the reptiles can deal with it. I don't know. I was maybe thinking about like how philosophers, having been part of the multitude of us who have been kicked out of the Garden of Eden, have tried to deal with this problem, I guess, of because there's kind of like two things of like I mean, if we go back to like attachment theory and psychology and stuff, like we know that I mean, I think there's something there at least, even if you don't completely believe in it. But there's something there of like having like a secure attachment is really beneficial. And it's really hard to not have a secure attachment and like be functional. And especially to have like kind of there is one specific type of attachment, I can't quite remember, but like the sort of attachment where, or lack thereof, where you can't ever really form like that bond of trust. Maybe it was like just avoidant, I think. But you just like are really incapable of having that like that deep level of trust, maybe because of like abuse or something like that that happened in your early life. And that's just really hard on people who have that. Like they just can't form relationships really, like of any kind. And that is obviously really bad for you, if you can't do that. So I guess the bottom line being that like it's hard to like kind of be functional if you don't have that sort of, you could say like illusion, I guess. Like that is the way that a lot of people, a lot of us get through to some degree, is that we have something that kind of tethers us in this great unknown. Um, but yeah, I guess that like philosophers being philosophers and like the existential philosophers especially kind of tried to grapple in some sense with this problem, I think, of like the loss of innocence or like the pointlessness, the meaninglessness, absurdity of life. I mean, two really come to mind for me, obviously, with the word absurd. One cannot help but think of Camus. And then also for me, I think a lot about, probably not as much anymore just because I don't, whatever. But I think a lot about Soren Kierkegaard. I think about the two of them a lot when it comes to this existential question of like life and the meaning of life and how to kind of like think of the world, I guess, or have yourself in relation to the world, maybe, or something like that. So I'll start with Kierkegaard. And Kierkegaard is really, I think, maybe I'm just biased because like I happen to read him or whatever, or cotton onto that. But I think like he's just got like some really insightful sort of philosophy into like the struggle of living, like how hard it is to be a person in the world and kind of grappling really deeply, grappling with faith. And that's something that I admire him for because, and I would admire anyone who can really do that for doing that because it's like it's really taking that idea, which is really so transcendental, I guess, this idea of faith, and kind of re-transcendentalizing it, maybe you could say. Because like sometimes it gets so watered down of like, oh, faith is just it's going to church on Sunday or whatever. It's eating the bread and drinking the wine and hallelujah, whatever. And it's like, is that really all there is to it? That's our answer to the great unknown is that. And so it's like kind of really diving deep into that and not like sort of countenancing any could say external temporal sort of authority that just kind of tries to be like, yeah, well, this is just the way it is or whatever. Yeah, well, this is the answer. It's God. It's the angry old man up in the sky. And he said, these 10 things are the good things or the bad, these 10 things or seven things are the bad things. And don't do those things and do these things. And then your life will have meaning. And it's like, okay, well, some people need something a little deeper than that, like Kierkegaard. And so, yeah, I really admire him for that. Well, Kierkegaard, I kind of know him from two of his great concepts, which are anxiety and despair. On anxiety, he kind of takes the story of the sacrifice of Isaac. Isaac. I know Isaac's is. Anyway, but so, in the biblical story that Abraham is commanded by God to sacrifice Isaac. And he just does this like really great thing where he kind of like does like his own little fan fictions almost of like the canon of the story, I guess, because the canon of the story is kind of like it almost misses the point, I guess, of itself. And this is maybe what happens like when a sort of like, mystical, rebellious, deeply like spiritual ascetic like religion like Christianity started out as like grows into a dominant temporal sort of force is that inevitably you just lose those sort of like you lose the understanding of what was like really of what was passed down to you. You keep the what is it? Maybe something like you keep the form but not the substance or whatever. But you know what I mean. Anyway, but he kind of like so the canonical story is that Abraham was told by God to go to Mount Moriah, I think it was, and like sacrifice his son Isaac to him. And then like he does that and he doesn't tell Isaac or whatever. And or like he just brings Isaac along and Isaac's like,
Oh, okay, I'll go with you, Dad. Like, I'll do that, and it'll be all like we're going on a trip, and I don't know exactly why, but I trust you.
or whatever. They get up to the mountain and then Abraham is about to sacrifice Isaac. And and then God sends an angel down and is like, haha, JK, bro, like I was just testing you. And then Abraham's like, oh, ha, ha, yeah, ha, ha, funny one, God. And then everyone lived happily ever after. And like that's story of like, oh, like
Wow, like he was so faithful. Like he followed like God's like command and whatever.
anyway, so that's the canonical story that has been kind of stripped of its sort of I don't know, really the interesting part of it, because like what is that? Like that's just telling people to do what they're told or whatever. And that's kind of boring. No, what's really interesting is he has like these like four like sort of like spins, I guess, like on the story. And some of them it's interesting because like some of them end materially differently. So like there's two different material endings. One where the canonical ending where Abraham ends up not sacrificing Isaac, and the other one where Abraham actually does kill Isaac. And like, I guess maybe that like if God like didn't say at the last moment to not do that. Um, and I guess like that's kind of part of the point of like that, like so if I remember correctly, in at least some, if not all of the stories, like God doesn't actually say it doesn't actually send the angel down at the last moment. And so that's like one of the main differences. In any case, that's kind of almost beside the point anyway, because it's supposed to be like your faith in God, like that you do anything, like that you would even murder your own child, which is like kind of like the in terms of conventional morality, right? Like it's very up there in terms of like wrong things to do. It's like you're murdering a child, you're murdering your child. Um, you're also like doing so under false pretenses from the child's perspective. So it's kind of bad, right? Like it's in a conventional sort of sense. Um, but it's like a test of your faith in God, right? Because if God told you to do that thing, no matter what it is, like you should do it. So that's like kind of the dilemma, right? And that's what Abraham is facing, and that's what Kierkegaard is kind of bringing back to the story is like, dude, this is a real dilemma. Like let's think about this. If you were actually in the situation where you were told by God to kill your own son, would you just be chill and say like,
Oh, yes, of course. Like yep, I'll just go right up the mountain and we're gonna
no, that is not what would happen. You would be like, oh my God, like oh my God. Oh my God. Like I'm like I totally should follow like my God's commands. I should totally follow like what my God tells me to. And I believe deeply in God that he has like a purpose, that a meaning behind this, that he said this, he told me to do this for a reason, but it's murdering my own son. And what if it's not really God? And or what if, what if it is God, but like maybe I shouldn't follow that anyway. Maybe it is right to not kill my son, even if it's in the name of God, like, so what should I do? If I'm really taking seriously both the faith in God and the love that I have for my only son, because Isaac was his only son. Isaac was his only child and he was begotten very late in life. And so he was especially precious to Abraham. And so if we're really taking it seriously, it should be just the greatest internal anguish that he's experiencing. This is not a trivial matter. And so that's the seriousness that Kierkegaard brings to it, which I really appreciate. And so he has the like four different versions. I can't remember exactly what they are, but four different versions of the story as I kind of described, that really seriously deal with that and that sense of like anxiety of like you can't ever completely know what is the right thing to do and what does it mean to have faith in something and to have faith in this world. So I suppose I don't know if this like kind of comes like temporarily before Kierkegaard's work on despair. I think it does, but I can't quite remember. But I think it like, they're related. Obviously, I mean they're written by the same person. But like they're related in the sense of like they have that same sort of underlying, yeah, like that angst of like we don't know exactly, and it's kind of a leap of faith, I guess. And that is really something that is really anguishing. Right. So Kierkegaard's idea, let's go into his ideas of despair. So Kierkegaard, this is another like sort of interesting twist, I think, and another reason to love Kierkegaard, but he has this really interesting sort of idea about despair, which is that kind of like it's not like a sort of it's not a linear process really. It's not like, oh, you start like, an obvious idea sort of is like despair is like down here, right? And let's say faith is like up here or something. And like you would kind of climb the steps up. So like the closer you kind of get to really having like that spirituality and faith and being transparently grounded in God and whatever, like the like sort of the in some sense the better you would feel maybe or something like that. But Kierkegaard kind of reverses that a little bit in some ways of like so like maybe you start here at like the despair like sort of unconscious despair like despair that doesn't know that it's in despair or whatever, which is maybe sort of like couch potato-ish sort of despair of like dang dude like you're just kind of like tuning out the world like you're not even aware in some sense that you're in that but that's kind of where you are. And that's maybe like here, like in terms of like how you feel. If you want to have like a utilitarian look at it, although I'm sure that Kierkegaard is not a utilitarian. But anyway, like you kind of start there and then like or well, maybe so not quite like in terms of utility, although like there's some utility like flavor to it, I guess. Like you kind of like struggle more like you go along the process. But basically, yeah, like that sort of like inner spiritual, could say like closeness in some sense to like being at that like on one dimension at least, the closeness of being like at that place of like kind of transcendentally, transparently having like faith in God, being grounded in God or whatever is like here. And you're like there. And then like, but as you kind of go along that process, like the more advanced your despair, the deeper it is, oftentimes. Or yes, I guess like in Kierkegaard's model, that's how it is. Um, and so like in some sense, you're kind of getting closer. You're making that progress because at least now you're not unaware of like your despair. Maybe you're despairing. There's like earthly despair, for example, like the despair of someone whose love has been rebuffed or something. Like you're just, oh, like it's just so sad. It's terrible. But like in some sense, like that, it's a deeper despair because you're aware of it. But you're kind of like you're not quite like kind of addressing in some sense what's really deeply, deeply, deeply at the root of that despair. It like kind of appears as something else. And one example that he gives that I really love, which is maybe kind of similar to that at a similar level, is like the despair of, I think it's called despair of like not willing to be oneself, where you are kind of despairing in the sense that you think that like your despair is about that you wish you could be somebody else or that you wish you could have someone else's characteristics. Like, and so he gives the example of like the person who wishes he was an emperor, which wishes he was Caesar. oh, like if I was as great, if only I was as great as Caesar, right? Like if only if I was had all of those conquests and accolades and capabilities and all of that, then I would be happy, right? Then I would be fulfilled. Then my life would have meaning. You're recognizing that there's despair, but it's not quite as deep because you are not quite understanding that is only what appears to be the source of your despair when it really is a symptom. It's a symptom of the despair. This despair goes deeper than that. And I guess like, you can kind of think of that being revealed by if like someone was to achieve like the things that they had so sought after and then realizes, well, I still feel empty inside. It didn't work to kind of heal that. And that's because you were treating the symptoms and not the disease. And Kierkegaard does liken it to a disease. He calls it the sickness unto death. And that is also the title of the book. Right. So yeah, you kind of go on this like journey of despair and it can get really intense. Like he has this one stage of despair. I don't remember exactly what it's called, but like he's like, yeah, well, either you kind of move to another stage of despair from this stage or you kill yourself. And it's pretty intense. Yeah, it's very intense sort of stage of despair. And I think it's real. Like there is like some sorts of like despair in life that are just really intense like that and that are not really sustainable. So yeah, going down that like journey, I guess, and kind of relaying it back to the Matrix, maybe. It's not the easy path, if you want to know the truth. It certainly is not easy. You could say things have to get worse before they get better, and there's no guarantee that they're going to get better. So he has those stages of despair, and his kind of like final stage of despair, which is really interesting, is the despair of defiance or defiant despair, I guess. And it's a sort of despair that sustains itself through resentment, through, well, through defiance, defiance towards God. And so in some sense, it is the furthest from God because you kind of see this need for the leap of faith. You see the anxiety, you see the despair, maybe for what it really is, but you kind of make the choice. You choose, I guess, in Kierkegaard's maybe like language or his framing of things to reject God. And I think Kierkegaard uses like the language of it's as if one says the pain that I've experienced in my life or in life in general, maybe is I will not forgive God for that. I will not, now it's too late and I will not forgive God. And it is as if I am a character in his book who spurns him as a bad writer. And that's how one sustains oneself in some sense by, well, so through defiance, through just being like, I will live in spite of that, in spite of there being no inherent purpose or there being no sort of sign from God, there being no guarantees from God, spite it, like, I will spite that. And that will be my life. And so that's really interesting to me because that kind of gets us into Camus and absurdism. So my understanding, so I don't know quite as much about Camus because I haven't actually read like a ton of his books or whatever. I read The Stranger, I read some papers back in like an intro philosophy class or whatever, probably. I know he's written on like suicide and stuff like that. So very cool. Cool dude. Yeah, but um that like he has that idea, so an absurdism of like kind of defiance, like so there is no meaning, inherent meaning in life. There's no guarantees or and the universe is cold and indifferent. And his philosophy is a recognition of that, but he chooses to and kind of posits that the purpose of life is found in like living in defiance. And I guess like that is kind of encapsulated in his like reimagination of Sisyphus, of the myth of Sisyphus, and his famous pronouncement that one must imagine Sisyphus happy, pushing the rock up the slope. And I guess like that happiness or, maybe the connotation is that that sense of meaning is found in defying this sort of meaninglessness of like and futility of like pushing the rock, right? And so I think for me, it's very interesting that it like kind of connects back to because well, also like that Camus, I don't think he liked the label of like absurdist. I think he identified like as an existentialist and is also identified as an existentialist by many. And it's funny that like so one of the you could say fathers of existentialism had also kind of like in some sense like come up with a similar sort of idea and almost like rebuked it in a sense, which is very interesting. And done so like 100 years before Camus did, and kind of embraced it. That's kind of where we're at, where I'm at with this sort of thing. And I think what's really interesting about it is it does get at something that I think is quite real. Of like once you realize what this sort of world is about like that, once you kind of have that sense of like the great, I could say like great betrayal of like that there is no sort of guarantee in the way that we're kind of born and raised to deeply expect. That is like quite traumatic in a very deep way. And so you can kind of go through the stages of despair. And one of the sorts of things I think that I run into sometimes is because here's the thing. Well, okay, so we're gonna go to another thing from philosophy. So there's a philosopher mathematician. It's not Descartes. His name was Gottfried Leibniz, and he had this sort of idea, and I don't know how serious he was about it, but he kind of like proposed or popularized or whatever this idea of like, what if this is the best of all possible worlds? And, using he had like a certain interesting definition of best, like sort of like the harmony and beauty of nature and all of that. And so like, what if this is the best possible world and God chose that? And that just kind of adds to the like the glory and goodness of God. Um, and like, so I don't necessarily dispute the facticity of the statement because it's very possible that this is the best of all possible worlds, especially if this is the only possible world. But like sort of the sentiment of it is there's something very off-putting about that, especially, I mean, to me, but I think it should be to a lot of people, or it is to a lot of people, and it should be off-putting because it's almost insulting in a sense. It's not only not insulting to people where it's like, okay, well, that person like got burned to death. You're saying that this is the best of all possible worlds. So you're saying like it couldn't have you couldn't imagine that things could have been better somehow. That God in his perfect infinite wisdom couldn't have just made it so the person didn't burn to death. But like, no one else had to like suffer something worse or something. Like that we were just imagining that God couldn't have done like I can imagine that not happening. So, God, like what's the holdup? So like in some sense, yeah, it's really strange. It's kind of insensitive to me when like people think about it that way because it's like, well, of course, like, I'm glad that your life is like good enough that you can entertain that possibility that this is the best of all possible worlds. But there are a lot of like people and animals, past, present, and unfortunately future, where that's not going to be the case. Where they're going to have lots of times where they're going to be like, this is not the best of all possible worlds. Or I hope it's not, because that would really suck. So there's some sense in which like that sort of naivete is just very, I just really feel like that's not the reason to accept it. It's almost like a sort of groveling sort of thing. Like, like that concept of like Stockholm syndrome. that's kind of like what I think about. And this is like a real problem for me, I guess, like of like even if like the literal concept of Stockholm syndrome is like overblown. I've definitely heard some things about like that not necessarily being true, but like still like there's something there of like, oh, like victim blaming or kind of justifying and um both on the individual level and like on the collective level, sorts of things like that, where it's like you're kind of like being taken in, you know? Like you're kind of letting the wool get pulled over your eyes, not seeing this thing that is just transparently there and transparently horrible because it's just like, I don't know, like it'd be more painful to like kind of see that or whatever. So you're kind of like, yeah, you're kind of just getting taken in there and being naive. And so there's like a very strong temptation to like resist that. At the same time, I'm also like kind of a bit tired of like cynicism. And like of running on defiance. And I don't think that running on defiance is ultimately a viable strategy. I just really don't believe in that either. Or like running on resentment. And like, you know, at some point it does feel like kind of the avoidance of not wanting to be taken in, not wanting to be made a fool of. Like if that's your only goal in life, maybe you're losing out on a lot from that, from not being willing to open yourself up like a little bit, I guess, to that, even if that is like something of a possibility. But you're missing something by just being cynical about everything. And so yeah, to me it's like kind of this great battle of like how do I make sense of all the horrible suffering and the senselessness of the world. I'm going to use the term I always qualify this, but I'm going to use the term Kafkaesque, even though I haven't actually read any of Kafka's works, maybe the Metamorphosis passages of it. But yeah, like that idea of so Kafka has this story, which I read the summary on Wikipedia of, called The Trial, which is also a great thing, and I should probably read it at some point. Now I would, you know, preemptively recommend it as well. Well, also any of the things that I referenced, authors I referenced, I also recommend reading them, whether or not I've actually read them. Anyway, um, but Kafka has this story called The Trial, and it's like about this man who gets accused of a crime, and he doesn't, but the thing is that he doesn't know what he's being accused of or why or anything like that. He's just one day he's just accused. And like, you know, the story goes on and whatever, blah, 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 and whatever some details get revealed, but essentially, like, even up to the very end, and at the very end, spoiler alert, he gets executed, and he's still like, what the fuck did I do? How did this happen? And so there's that idea of like Kafkaesque situations where things just don't make sense. Or there's a very deep like senselessness and a horror that comes from that senselessness in the world. And so that when people are kind of dropped into that side of things almost, like that normally there's that illusion of like things make sense. There is some sort of justice or something. Um, or whatever. But like that sometimes you can kind of get glimpses into that world of like where things really don't make any sense and things just happen very arbitrarily. Right. So that was a segue, and I don't know where that came from exactly. So dealing with that. Yeah, right. So dealing with that and also dealing with like, you know, not just wanting to be cynical about everything necessarily. So having that awareness of like the Kafka-esque nature of the world, you could say, and also still being willing to like have faith, I guess, and and to kind of not be resentful or holding on to things is something that I'm still trying to figure out. And that maybe everyone is. And like what it means to like kind of have like that faith. Like a really the true like sort of faith, not like a sort of shallow one that is conveniently maintained by people who can afford to kind of live in this sort of like ignorance or pretense. Yeah, like even like being aware of all the horrible things in the world and not only that though, the very deep nature of that there is nothing that inherently will create meaning out of that. There is nothing that guarantees anything to us. There's no cosmic justice. There is no cosmic sense. Nothing really makes sense. There's no point to anything. Well, on top of that, like all of that, like there being the horror in the world, being able to hold that in mind and then also not be resentful and not be driven by despair, I think is a balance that very few have probably struck in their lives. Yeah, so still like kind of working on that, I guess. I don't know. I mean, I think I am like hopeful and like maybe one thing that offers some insight of where to go next is like this idea. And I'll just like say like one of the sources of that, like from Yuval Noah Harari, I think it was in 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. But like the idea basically that like reflects an old wisdom, I guess, that like meaning comes helping others, from helping other people, from alleviating suffering. Um, and like maybe there is something there of like maybe the point is like whatever faith is like that will to reduce suffering, to do good for the world, and to kind of like wherever you are at, no matter where you are or like what setbacks you've faced or what external, quote unquote, whatever circumstances you're in, whatever uncertainties you have, even about like the actions that you will take, that like you can make the choice to have faith that, like to have faith that you can do something to reduce suffering. And again, yeah, so I should reiterate that like you don't know for sure like that it's going to work. You don't know, you don't have full control over yourself or your circumstances or whatever. Lots of things can happen out in the world. There's lots of uncertainty. Things are really hard and can be really hard and all of that, but like that you can still kind of like have that faith, I guess, in that choice. And you can have that from a place of like really deeply loving all of the beings out there in the world, even if, and like maybe loving the world in the sense of wanting to make it a better place and caring that it's a better place, even if the world doesn't love you back. And not and also maybe so there's this really great short story by Ted Chiang called called Hell is the Absence of God. It's a really great short story. All of his stories are great, but it's a really great story and kind of like delves into like the story of Job in a sort of Kierkegaardian way. And I won't spoil that. But anyway, I guess that's what that reminded me of. Like, but anyway, not like in a sort of like servile sense of like,
Oh, well, I'll love the world even though it doesn't love me back. Oh,
like
I'm a martyr or
or
whatever.
whatever, sort of stuff. But more in the sense of like the love will just emanate from me. And it's not about that. Like it kind of is beyond that in some sense that it almost is like an afterthought. Like it doesn't even really enter into the mind of like as it being a sort of like transactional sort of relationship or something or whatever, or that somehow it's like sad if like the world doesn't love me back. It's more just like unconditional, I guess, like sort of love for the world in the sense of wanting to make it a better place. And oh yeah, that's like really interesting because I think it's like it gets into the question for me of like what does it mean to like love suffering? Okay, like so not in like the masochistic way, but like if you are, taking a sort of wellness approach of like part of what wellness entails or like self-compassion or something or compassion like entails is like loving the parts that are not necessarily the easiest to love, let's say, then like suffering is that, like, or experiences of great suffering are like that. Like how do you love, your grief, or how do you love, yeah, your anger or your intemperance or whatever, your fear. And so like what does it mean to like love that? Like because like on one sense when we talk of like fighting suffering, eliminating suffering, banishing suffering. And so that doesn't seem very like loving, it doesn't seem very accepting. And so kind of seems to run counter to those tenets of like self-acceptance or acceptance or love, unconditional love that are maybe very central in some ways to these doctrines of, well, I shouldn't say doctrines, but like these principles of practices that are really trying to help us to get to that sense of like spiritual wellness and love and all that. Right. But then on the other hand, we don't just want to like sit on our hands, right? We don't just want to be like, well, I guess it's fine. Like that seems to be wrong too. So there's something there of like maybe in some sense you could say I like to think of it maybe as something like you are letting it go. Like you're lovingly letting it go. I guess like maybe part of the thing is like that suffering, you could say in and of itself doesn't want to be there, doesn't want us to be holding on to it. It wants to be let go of. And so it's like honoring the wish in some sense of like the suffering to acknowledge it and let it go. And that is like the form of love. And so you can love the suffering. You don't have to hate the suffering. You can love the suffering and also accomplish the purpose of alleviating it. And so maybe that's like the sense in which you can like love the world, even if it's full of suffering and evil and stuff. I don't know. Yeah, I guess I'm still figuring that out, but I think there's something there. And I think that's the way. But it is kind of a very narrow thread to follow. And a lot of times it is easier to kind of just eyes glaze over to YouTube shorts or whatever. Yeah, I mean, I think if there's anything that stories in the Bible or whatever got right, it's that there's no going back to Eden. Whether or not we wish for that going back to innocence. And it would be easy for me to kind of end the video or something by saying like, well, I'm so glad though that I know or whatever, and then I'm not ignorant anymore, and that like, I that it's really better in a way that I'm not innocent or something like that, or like, there's something to suffering and like that enhances the depth of life that one is no longer innocent or something like that. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, that seems like kind of cope, you know. So yeah, and like at the same time, like wanting to kind of dwelling too hard like on innocence also seems kind of weird. It's not quite the right answer in a sense if you believe in like right answers or like maybe I don't mean it exactly in that way, but hopefully you can kind of get a sense of what I'm trying to say here. I mean, I am glad to have lost my innocence in the sense that it allows me to try to make the world a better place. if I didn't know all these things, I couldn't do that. And there is like some meaning that comes out of it. At the very least, like that sense of I've had like kind of times in my life where I've like kind of felt like my life is like meaningless or whatever. But I think like more recently in the last like couple of years, like I haven't really had that. At least like I should say I haven't had that in the same sense. Like maybe I've had it because I've been like I felt like I was materially blocked or something from going in the direction that I wanted to go. But I didn't feel as much like I kind of had like that sense of like just being like, I don't know what to do with my life or whatever. What's the point of like my life or what am I trying to go after with this? So it's a very like kind of meaningfully engaging like sort of task that's like trying to reduce suffering stuff. So yeah, I guess like it's not all bad. I guess like there's maybe the idea is like something that like innocence is sort of implying that one is ignorant. And I do believe, or like one is ignorant and sort of cherubish and in some sense like very helpless or something like that, childlike. And like there's a sense in which like, you don't maybe want that to like be where someone is. Yeah, no one should have to like suffer through things the way many of us do. And like that's maybe the part that like I would object to and wish like that didn't have to happen for like me or for anyone else who, goes through that sort of process. So yeah, that part is certainly not something to celebrate. And I would prefer a world in which like that sort of suffering didn't have to happen and we could still have like the sort of like the joy that we have like in childhood and the wonder and all that. That kind of seems to be so often stripped away with our innocence as we become jaded and we kind of realize like the sort of things that happen out there in the world. Yeah, I guess that's kind of like my thoughts on this sort of topic, very existential and deep sort of thing. And I don't know. So maybe it's interesting to someone. No idea. I guess I'm thinking about I'll have two songs of the video, unprecedented. So one is called Take Me Back to Eden by Sleep Token, and the other is called Motherland by Natalie Merchant. And I think they're both great and sort of relevant songs to this sort of topic. And I guess that's where I will leave today's monologue. So thanks for watching, my dear Fruit Loops, and take care of yourself. Maybe innocence is not evergreen, but I think we can still be happy and we can still create our own meaning, hopefully, in trying to make the world better and make each other better and make ourselves better. And I have been heartened by how many people out there and how many of my friends and family and all of that and people I know have been doing those sorts of things. So yeah, spread the love and the happiness and stuff, and that's kind of all we need, I guess, hopefully. So peace out, Fruit Loops. I will see you next time.